I think, one of the things I think about is really being able to navigate the pandemic in 2000 and being able to continue to organize people to be able to get good information and vote. And at the same time, have our legal team open up mail balloting in a lot of states that didn't want to do it so that they could protect people from having to go to the polls.
I would agree. I think Fair Election Center has really demonstrated a lot of stability, especially in trying times. The last few years, we've seen a lot of challenges against voting rights in the United States. And I think we've proven that we have the ability to weather the storm and to grow, but most importantly, stability. So whether or not it's with our litigation and policy team, doing work across various states, or it's our campus program, working on campuses to make sure that administrators and students have the tools that they need in this environment. And then finally, with our poll working program, making sure we can actually have elections. I mean, there's 47 states that rely on poll workers, and we've been able to get hundreds of thousands of people to sign up to be poll workers.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other thing is being able to sustain a staff that continues to contribute to the organization on an ongoing basis and grow the organization. Those have all been really important.
There's been so many challenges to voting rights in the United States over the last few years, especially with seeing the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act, seeing that there's barely pieces of the act that remains in order to make sure that we have full protections when Americans are headed to the ballot box. But then we have certain states that are introducing, and some states have passed legislation to criminalize different aspects of what have been traditional hallmarks of voting, such as having third-party groups do voter registration, community groups deciding that they want to make sure that their neighbors who want to vote and who are eligible to vote are able to vote. There are some states where those things aren't allowed the way they were in the past. Or, thinking about our neighbors. Some of our neighbors aren't able to return their ballots on their own. They might have different medical issues that prevent them from being able to do that. So we have some states that have made it harder for you to help more than two of your neighbors. And if you help more than two of your neighbors, it has become criminalized to help turn in ballots. And so those are some of the challenges that we've seen.
Yeah, I agree. And we also have the rise of misinformation and disinformation that has really made it harder for people to understand what they're seeing and whether it's real or not. And particularly in putting new information out that might confuse voters, even about what the process is and whether or not, they can vote in a certain way that they want to vote or in a certain time they want to vote. I think that's a problem. The other thing that I'm concerned about right now is we've now seen a number of major law firms refuse and sort of back off under the threat of the administration from providing the kind of robust support that they've done in the past for voting rights community and for people that are traditionally marginalized in our society and those that face particular barriers to voting. And that concerns me as well. I think the other thing that we know is that because of the gerrymandering that's taken place for a while now, you have state legislatures that are really very difficult to sort of unseat. And so people have really hardline positions on things. And we've seen states, as you just alluded to, do some things that would be unheard of in terms of putting barriers in the way of just the average person's ability to help people vote, or for that matter, election officials, for them to be able to do their job. And they do it with impunity, knowing that the end result is they're not going to get called on it. Now, maybe, some of our litigators or some other litigators can go to court and in some cases stop it. And they've done that, and we've done that, but not enough. And it all leads to this added confusion for people. And some people, it's like if you make it hard enough and there are enough barriers and they're worried about enough, some people will unfortunately decide not to vote.
Yeah, with the challenges of voting in this country, each individual in this country who is eligible to vote should be able to vote, period. But like you said, there are a lot of states where there's more friction that's created in the process. And we know the more friction that occurs when someone is trying to access the ballot box, like you said, they're less likely to spend hours in line and voting. Like we've seen states like Georgia that has now criminalized if you see someone standing in line for hours on end and you give them a bottle of water or give them a snack, all of a sudden that is now a criminal act. When instead we should be figuring out, how do we make sure that lines don't take hours just to exercise your right to vote in this country? Why is it in certain communities lines are 5+ hours, but other communities you could get in and out in less than 15 minutes? Basically, regardless of your zip code in this country, voting should be easy. Voting should not be hard.
The other thing that, as you know, we've seen, because of the work we do on college campuses, there's an increasing effort to target young voters and therefore college students with additional barriers and additional problems. Whether it's moving precincts off campus, telling students they can't register in their new community and giving them a lot of misinformation about, your parents wouldn't be able to claim you on their taxes, or you'd lose health insurance coverage from your parents' plan, none of which is true. But we see that, and then explicitly we see, in some cases, local clerks being very anti-student when it comes to facilitating somebody who's living in their community now, 9 months out of the year, 4 years maybe, or 2 years, and oftentimes will stay there. So it is a continued problem. And for example, one other thing, a number of states are now targeting student IDs, which have been used and acceptable and should be acceptable for voting ID, and basically saying IDs are fine, but not student IDs. In fact, you can work at this university and get an ID out of the same ID machine, but if you're a student, you can't vote, but if you're an employee of the university, you can.
Even in this climate, we still have seen both policy and litigation wins. When I think about in 2024, when we filed a lawsuit in Alabama, where there were thousands of eligible voters who were removed off of the rolls within 90 days, which is something that can't happen under HAVA. What we saw, like through that litigation, is we saw that there was actually a legislative fix of where those voters were restored. And so we've noticed that when we put our flag down in certain states and we elevate the issue that's impacting voters, we do see action, whether or not it's through the actual court system or it's through legislators or administrators who are responding to our legal action.
Yeah, we won major victory in Arizona, helping two grassroots Hispanic organizations who were doing voter registration work in the community, knocking down a law that would have allowed clerks who suspected somebody on the voting rolls to be a non-citizen without any real standards what that meant. And it just intimidates people. We were able to block that law, and it was upheld on appeal. We've also recently were able to succeed in getting a bunch of voters who were potentially going to be knocked off the rolls in Wisconsin, staying on the rolls for the election. So we do have some, good wins, and in the recent past, our litigation team has won some really great victories before that as well.
And even thinking about how our litigation impacts our work on campus, I think about several years ago when we represented Justin Jones in the state of Tennessee when he was a student at Fisk University, where we fought to make sure that university IDs were counted as state IDs for students for the purposes of voting. And so we're able to work across program and to see wins across our various programs.
Right. Then in terms of our legislative work, our policy team has been involved in a number of places, protecting people who are convicted of felons, getting back on the rolls, changing the language in New Mexico, for example, and also doing other work to promote the work of schools being able to sort of participate in more robust education of their students in the voting process. And then lastly, working on opening up more opportunities for polling places to be pushed, to be put onto campuses and so on. And then, our team, our legislative team and policy team also has helped block a number of bad bills recently. And I think, that's the great thing about this organization is that we do help people vote with information and education, and we support them in the courts and in the legislature, and even with administrators, both on the good side, helping them do their job to get more voters to vote, and on the side of calling out sometimes administrators are doing things that make it harder to vote. And we've been successful in backing some of that stuff off.
The uniqueness of the work that we do at Fair Election Center is that we look for barriers to voting, and then we do our hardest to try to remove them, whether it's barriers from students on campus, whether it's barriers of those who are returning citizens who have served their time and now they're trying to re-engage in their community. We want to remove those barriers and make sure that they have access to the ballot box as well.
Right. The other thing that I feel good about is all of our resources we've been able to sort of make them available to larger groups of communities that have traditionally been disenfranchised. And, whether that's the growing AAPI community, which we've been really helping a lot of the groups that we're starting to do more voting work by getting the kind of information that our voting guides provide, by doing training for them. The same thing is true with, we're a founding member of the Native American Voting Rights Coalition and working with various tribes in Indian country to make sure that their rights are protected in terms of voting. And then in just the other constituencies that traditionally have been seen barriers, continuing to work with allied organizations in the Black community and the Hispanic community, and trying to be good partners with people that are doing a lot of important work on the state level. When I first was looking for a partner to hire to be a vice president, because I was running this organization sort of on my own with other, I really wanted to make sure it's somebody that I could see as a peer and make decisions together and then ultimately take over, which is now going to happen, which is great. And I think it's so interesting because you and I have very different styles, to say the least. But we kind of complement each other. And, I'm trying to think of, there's so many of the decisions we made that we really agree on. And there have been some that we haven't agreed on. But in the end, I really appreciate that your focus is what's the result. And, you're a combination of sort of anticipating and imagining what's possible and being practical. And then I always love the stories you tell about the campaign wars that you've been involved in.
What I most admire about Bob is Bob doesn't know the word no. And I think that is fantastic in this environment. It's because we constantly hear no on voting rights. We constantly are hearing, especially as we do nonpartisan political work, we're constantly told the reason why we can't do something. And Bob doesn't hear that. Bob thinks about, but here's a possibility. Just because it's not working today doesn't mean it's not going to work tomorrow. So these are the things that we could do today to envision a better tomorrow.
Actually, it's not a memory of work per se, but I love hearing the stories about your family and the background of your family. And, and frankly, sort of all the things that sort of brought you to the place you are now. And we get lots of laughs and I think about sort of talking about our families from time to time.
My favorite stories about Bob, and this is where Bob and I have a lot of similarity. We have such weird, non-linear backgrounds. It's almost like we both have a hodgepodge of experiences that both led us to the present moment. If we didn't have any of those experiences, we would not be the people who we are. And I don't think we would be able to do this work effectively if we didn't just lean into opportunities as they arose instead of trying to follow a traditional path. Because I don't think you get to be creative in leading on voting rights if you're only putting one foot in front of the other. You have to have the ability and wherewithal to take risk, because working on voting rights, you have to be a risk taker in order to do that. If you care more about the status quo, then you'll never be able to push forward on voting rights. So I think my favorite stories about Bob are the off the beaten path stories, because it really gives me a great insight into who Bob is and what his why is.